For your awareness, start recording. The Online Events Committee also has other events through several event tracks, so please look out for announcements about those events and see past events on IAFFE's YouTube channel. I want to start off just with some friendly reminders for today's event. As with past events, we will be recording today's event and posting it to YouTube. This is a Zoom meeting and it is not a webinar. That means it's incredibly important to keep yourself muted to not disrupt the flow of things. But there will be a time later in the event where you can raise your hand and come off mute in the Q&A. But throughout the event, please do feel free to share resources and put comments and questions in the chat. Today we are featuring Spanish and French interpretation, which you can find by using the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. For those of you who are English speakers, during the Q&A, we might have questions come through for those who are speak Spanish or French. So you might want to click the English icon in the interpretation, even though the event today will be in English. So today we are joined by three members of the Barriers to Feminist Economics Committee. The first is Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, who is a professor of international affairs at my alma mater, the New School, and a long-serving member of IAFFE, as well as the president-elect of IAFFE. She is a development economist and social scientist whose work is grounded in capabilities and human rights and has published widely on a range of themes, from gender to technology to food security and more. Her co-authored book, Fulfilling Social and Economic Rights, won the, might say this wrong, Grawemeyer Prize for Changing World Order and the Best Book Prize from the Human Rights section of the American Political Science Association. She was one of 15 economists featured in The Women Who Made Modern Economics by Rachel Reeves. Prior to joining the faculty of the New School, she had a long career at the United Nations, best known for her work on human development reports. Her recent and current work focuses on the political economy of knowledge and measurement in policymaking, international norms, and scholarly research. Welcome, Sakiko. For today's event, Sakiko will be introducing her 4 Eyes framework of systemic barriers that obstruct the spread of new ideas in policymaking. This includes institutions, information, ideology, and interests. And this is going to be followed by commentary from 2 other distinguished members of the committee. The first will be Diane Elson, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Essex, UK. Her writings, many of which are collaborative, have pioneered feminist economics on many fronts, particularly macroeconomics and gender and labor, and economics and human rights. She has a long history of policy engagement with the United Nations and the UK government. She currently chairs the UK Women's Budget Group, which is a voluntary network of researchers, trade unionists, and feminist activists that analyzes the impact of UK government budgets on gender equality and low-income women. Among her many recognitions, Diane is the winner of the Leontief Prize on Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought and was named in David Simon's book, 50 Key Thinkers in Development. Welcome, Diane. And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Elizabeth Prugel, who is a professor honoraire at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where she was also the founding director of the Institute's Gender Center. Her research over the course of her academic career is focused on feminist international relations and gender politics and international governance. She has written on the international regulation of atypical forms of women's labor, such as industrial homework and agricultural labor, and on gender mainstreaming and gender expertise in international governance. Current projects center on gendered practices of social reproduction and survival in the context of violence, in particular the war in Ukraine. Prugel was a recipient of the Eminent Scholar Award of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the International Studies Association, and since January 2002, she has been a co-editor-in-chief of the International Feminist Journal of Politics. Welcome so much, Elizabeth. As you can see, we have a really distinguished group of speakers here today to really dive into what we mean and how we can think about barriers to feminist economists and economics. So first, let me turn it over to you, Sakiko, to present the framework.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And let me share my screen. Let's see, share. And I have to put it to Um, no. Okay. I won't belabor introductory remarks, but the idea of barriers, can be thought about in many different ways. And what I'm going to present today is work that I did a couple of years ago to try to explore barriers to the introduction to considering macroeconomic policies in national policy, in developing national policy frameworks for reducing inequality, developing sustainable inclusion in sustainable development frameworks. So here I have, and so this framework is to look at structural obstacles in the way that policy making. So this is focused on barriers in policy making. But as I will explain, I think this is a framework that could be used as an analytical kind of framework to explore many things, barriers in many other areas, and notably the influence of feminist economics in both research and policy making. So I want to start by pointing out that what we're talking about are epistemic silos. Silent silos in the way in knowledge systems, in the way that people think about problems. And so there has long been a siloing of macroeconomics from social concerns. And in a 2012 special issue in the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, Deepak Nair wrote, "It would be reasonable for an economics undergraduate or a concerned citizen to believe that there's a relationship between the state of economics at a macro level and the living conditions of people at the micro level. Yet a reading of the literature suggests that these are two different worlds. The twain almost never meets. The discussion seldom intersects. Macroeconomics have their world of thinking, and people concerned with people as economists, like feminist economists, that work in a different world." Now, our speaker, Diane, wrote with her co-author, Nilüfer Çağatay, "Although there is now widespread recognition of the need to integrate macroeconomic management and social policies, there is a strong tendency to think this means continuing to design what are termed sound macroeconomic policy with a focus on market-based criteria, and then adding social policies in order to achieve socially desirable outcomes such as poverty reduction." This was written in 2000. So I think the problem of silos is kind of widely understood, that this is something that is pervasive. So this is a case study of exploring why such silos exist and why ideas from, in this case, heterodox, if you like, or capabilities-based thinking about poverty reduction don't actually connect with macroeconomics, or why it is a macroeconomic. And in this particular case, we focus on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and strategies for the commitment to leave no one behind in implementing sustainable development goals. And this is based on the finding of a review that I was part of that looked at 220 national voluntary reports submitted on government policies for SDG implementation. The finding there is that these national policies rely largely on social protection and social investments to achieve this objective of devising and developing sustainable development strategies that make sure that they leave no one behind. which is a commitment of the SDGs. And so there's obviously a neglect of, and no, sorry, I've neglect of the very powerful macroeconomic policy tools for equity and inclusion, such as fiscal policy and monetary policy. So why is this? Why is it that policymakers who are leading strategies for sustainable development neglect macroeconomic policies? Do they not know that such things as progressive taxation actually can make a difference to reducing inequality? Or why is it that on the other side, that macroeconomists ignore consequences of macroeconomic policies on human well-being and inequality, such as employment, wages? Of course, they know all of these things, but they don't actually put it into practice in their professional work. So what we do here is to explore basically what is epistemic politics of policymaking. And as Mary already mentioned, my co-author, I have to admit to explain that this is co-authored work with Kate Donald. We identified 4 interrelated and mutually reinforcing structural barriers. So the first is institutional silos and gaps. I think we're all familiar with the fact that, governments, for example, or other decision-making bodies have departments that act in silos, and each one has its own kind of agenda, and they don't always coordinate, they don't always speak to each other. That's a sort of a common problem of silos. But more important, I think we also have to recognize that each of these departments has its own norms and methods, and then that they are staffed by specific epistemic communities. So epistemic communities is a sort of a well-established concept in this field of sort of politics of knowledge, where there's people who study the same things, people share the same kind of training, they share the same concepts and ways of thinking about problems. And these silos are very difficult to break down, even though there is an injunction to actually work through a whole of government approach. But the other issue is that institutional mandates of economic institutions are narrow, and increasingly so. Central bank mission is to stabilize the economy. There has always been a concern with the mission of employment, but this is not always recognized in the charter of central banks, and the dual mandate central banks is rare. So now the second I is information deficits. There's a narrow knowledge base of people working in these fields. I think economists tend to specialize. There are very few economists in central banks or the ministries of finance who have studied or who know very much about the latest literature on inequality. They're probably all stuck in the Kuznets curve that has been debunked decades ago. But maybe they had only one class in one course on inequality when they were undergraduates. And since then, they've really been specialized in finance or monetary policy or something of that kind without reference to the social consequences. There's also very little limited research on the distributional effects of monetary policies. Also, the models that are used, for example, by central bankers don't necessarily incorporate these distributional concerns. I mean, they are set up in a way to make this impossible because they only have one principal agent. Training and that there's a sort of a generalized trend of training in mainstream training in economics departments that focuses on core literature and that omits these distributive human impacts, which are actually drawn from heterodox literature like feminist economics and others. And there's a very tightly knit epistemic community of macroeconomists who work on issues like fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I see Mary nodding her head because I think in her think tank, half of the people there are probably macroeconomists, and they probably have never read anything in feminist economics, even though they know that such a thing exists. And they probably do care about people, and they probably do care, but they don't think about it as part of their intellectual battery, so to speak. Um, Now, the third thing is the ideological commitments. I think since the 1990s, the belief in neoclassical economics has turned into an ideology. I mean, this is what Deepak Naya says, who edited the special issue on the relationship between human development and macroeconomics, and made this statement at the beginning of this presentation, that the price stability and fiscal balance as core objectives of macroeconomic management have become so deeply entrenched in the belief system of individuals who influence policy and shape public opinion in politics and government, it is no surprise that orthodox belief system has been transformed into a virtual ideology. And then there is the narrative of there is no alternative, all right? So there is this very robust infrastructure of macroeconomic analysis that is just sort of impervious to this non-mainstream thinking. So the fourth I is interests and power structures. And this is sort of like maybe the most interesting part of it, that sort of bring all these things together. That economic policy making is, I mean, once again, I take the example of a central bank in part because there is a very interesting literature that analyzes these things in central banks, particularly by Epstein and his co-authors in various articles and books. It's basically they're very committed to the principle of technocratic policymaking, unbiased, technocratic, evidence-based, model-driven policymaking with no bias. But in reality, this is taking place in a political environment, and and therefore this policymaking is actually a battleground for control fought by different economic, social, and political forces. And this is a quote from Epstein. But this politics of this battle play out in very kind of underground ways and through these kind of knowledge systems. And that's why this is about the politics of knowledge. And in the case of like interest rate policy in central banks, more orthodox policies favor finance and capital rather than labor and public. And it's not because they're being, bribed to take certain positions, or they are overtly belonging to political parties or anything of that kind, but it's the knowledge systems in which they operate has a certain power structure, and people in finance have the knowledge about financial markets. There is a kind of a revolving door between central bank and other government agencies and private banks. Private banks, they're also dependent on private banks to implement and the policies and make these policy recommendations sort of like real and operationalized. And most importantly, I think, is coming back to this idea of an epistemic community, they're part of that same group, and they probably went to the same universities. They may meet over drinks somewhere. They may be friends. They're part of the same social network. So this really empowers, or this gives much greater power to the financial sector interests as actors rather than the public at large or labor. I don't know why it's so difficult for me to move this. Sorry, I'm just unable. Oh, here it is. So this framework is a framework to research structural barriers to the spread of feminist economics ideas and the opportunities for feminist economists. I think it can be used in that fashion. And in a variety of ways. It's a very simple framework. It's a sort of almost like a checklist, if you like. It is based on a conceptual framework of what I would call epistemic politics or politics of knowledge. And it can be used to explore barriers through in-depth case studies in diverse fields. So in this case, we talked about like monetary fiscal policies and sustainable development policies. But you could do the same kind of exercise in areas of trade policy or trade theory or social protection or climate fashion or finance or history of economic thought or any other topic that one might think about. I'm currently thinking of, well, I've been working on intellectual property regimes, actually with the same framework. It can also be used through in-depth exploration focused on specific barriers. For example, looking in depth at the content of training of economists, or how narratives have turned beliefs into ideology, and how they, relate to power. We can look also at the structures of key institutions like universities when it comes to feminist economists. So it's I think one could actually create an interesting research agenda using this framework to explore a number of ways of understanding barriers to feminist economics and then identifying more precisely what needs to be done to address those barriers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakiko. And you did indeed see me nodding at a lot of that as I seek to bring heterodox and feminist economics perspectives in wherever I can. Before turning over to Diane, I did want to say one thing I forgot in the beginning, which is that I think the calendar invite for today might have only reflected as an hour when it showed up, but this event does go until 11:15 Eastern time, just so we will have time to address all of your questions. With that, Diane, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this. I think Sakiko has given us a very interesting framework for thinking about our discussion on barriers to feminist economics. So I'm going to make two overarching points, and then I'm going to refer in more detail to her 4 I's. The first overarching point I want to make is we're talking about feminist economics, but I think we're going to have to think about varieties of feminist economics. Some kinds of feminist economics are much closer to the mainstream than other kinds of feminist economics. And I think that will be very important in thinking about where are the barriers. The second is Sakiko developed this framework for thinking about macroeconomic policy and inequality and human development. And I think as we apply it more, or we think about these issues more broadly, I also find it helpful to think in terms of a macro, meso, micro framework, so that we're thinking about these macroeconomic policies and models and so forth, thinking about the whole economy, but also there's the micro level of households and communities, and there's the meso level of markets and public services. And I mean, arguably, feminist economics made a lot more headway at the micro level than it has at the macro level. I think this is something that Bina, who I see is on this meeting, has written about in some of her writings. So I think we all want to differentiate between these different levels of policy and analysis in thinking about barriers. Then in terms of these particular 4 I's that Sakiko has identified, and this is a framework that can obviously be shaped and extended in various ways. So on the institutional silos and gaps, yes, I agree with everything she says about the policy level. Anybody who's ever worked with any government or UN agency knows this very well. There are also silos in the universities between different departments, silos about what counts as economics. In many universities, the kind of thing I've always done doesn't really count as economics because it's not got lots of equations in it. So there are silos there. But also we're now at a moment of not just silos, we're at a moment of institutional destruction. So I think with the things that the Trump government in the US is doing both in the US and internationally. So I think this is also something we're going to have to contend with, the issue of institutional destruction, not just silos and gaps, but you're not going to have a women's ministry anymore. You're not going to have a gender unit. You're not going to have an equalities committee. So how do we deal with that? Then what Sakiko called informational inadequacies, I distinguish two aspects of that. I think Sakiko focused quite a lot on the issue of models. And I think for a long time, we've talked about what Isabaka called the strategic silence in models that simply render invisible a lot of the concerns of feminist economics. So there is that issue of the inadequacies in terms of not so much what the models have in them as to what they don't have in them. And the assumptions they make about the out of equilibrium behavior, not just the comparative statics. But there's also an issue of missing data. And that issue of missing data has again suddenly become much, much more acute when we're seeing destruction of repositories of data that affect not just the US, but internationally. So it's not just that we don't have the data that we need, it's not timely, it's just that the data we did have is now being destroyed. That's going to be a big challenge in many instances in the future. Then ideological biases. I think there's a point at which the informational inadequacy in terms of modeling shifts over into ideological biases. And long ago, I wrote about male bias in macroeconomics, which I identified as stemming from the presumptions of the models about what they included and what they didn't, and their presumptions about out of equilibrium behavior and how economies adjust or restabilize. And I argued those oversights were a form of male bias, masked by a veneer of gender neutrality. I think this is a particular issue in macroeconomics because, as Kiko has said, macroeconomics doesn't directly deal with people, it deals with abstract aggregates. And therefore, it's often very difficult for people working on macroeconomics to see, well, where does feminist economics come in? This is true of heterodox economists as just as much as of mainstream economists. If it's at the macro level, these are, well, where does gender come in? This is gender neutral, what we're talking about, because we're not differentiating male and female. And of course, feminist macroeconomics has challenged that assumption in various ways for quite a long time. But again, I think we've got a new battleground, which is not just even the strategic silences or the ideology that the orthodox is correct and is a valid way of representing the world and generates good policy. We have got anti-feminist ideology now to contend with, not just leaving out things that ought to be there and making presumptions about, say, how markets work, which don't match reality, but actually anti-feminist thinking, anti-feminist action, a backlash, which we're now seeing trying to influence the way that universities can do research, for instance. So I think we've got a big challenge there in terms of this overt anti-feminism. In a way, if you go and talk to people at the bank and the fund, you may have disagreements with them, but they're not overtly anti-feminist. Now, if you go to the State Department in the USA, yeah, there's going to be anti-feminist. And in many countries as well, there is that anti-feminist backlash against the kind of policies that we might be interested in. And the final point I make is about the fourth I, the interest-driven pressures. I think this is really important, and it's not just finance and financial markets, although I agree with what Sakiko said there. It's generally the power of the rich. And we're seeing that very importantly in relation to taxation. One of the things that we really need to do in most countries in order to promote gender equality is raise more tax in a gender equitable way and spend it in a way that addresses all of the issues that feminist economists have identified. Well, there's a big pushback against taxing the rich. And indeed, we see in the US right now a big push for reducing massively the taxes of the rich. Perhaps not quite that in many countries, but in my own country, where we keep saying, but Rachel Reeves, to get out of the bind you put yourself in, you've got to raise taxes on the rich. Then there's a big pushback against raising taxes from the rich, not only from the rich themselves, but from middle of the road institutions like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which says, well, you know, you won't get much revenue from this because the rich have always got ways of evading your attempts to tax them. So that pressure, I think, the interest-driven pressures is important. And of course, within that, there are also the professional interest groups who police boundaries for what's going to count as economics, and whether the gatekeepers who will admit or not admit varieties of feminist economics. So let me end by saying I find this a very interesting framework to start our discussion, and I think we're got a particularly challenging context now for thinking about barriers to feminist economics, which none of us dreamed would be this challenging, I think, when last year IAFFE decided to embark on this project. Thank you, Sakiko, for getting us discussing this.
Thank you, Diane. Incredibly important points. And as you said, I think it is a very important time for us to be talking about this, and the term destruction of a lot of the things that are dear to us kind of came up in your comments, which I think is happening, you know, continues to happen by the day, right? As well as the difficulty of making inroads into certain aspects of economics. You both brought up the macro piece in particular. Elizabeth, let me turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I feel like what I'm going to do with my few minutes here is mostly to translate what Sakiko has been saying into international relations, which is the field that I'm writing for. And so just to start off with, so when I read this article, it struck me, it just really spoke to me. I think it's a really rich article. I actually encourage everybody to read it, because there's so much more in there than what Sakiko actually was able to convey. But it struck me as just kind of really capturing a lot of the politics that goes on in international governance, which is where I am coming from. And the four I's capture in many different ways some of the politics that I've been looking at in other fields as well. In IR, we often make kind of a tripartite distinction between explanations about how international governance works. And it's, on the one hand, the interest-based explanations. The second one are the power-based explanations. And the third ones are the knowledge-based explanations. And what I think Sakiko's framework does, it actually really centers knowledge-based explanations, which is really interesting also in the context of the Barriers Project, obviously, because economics is all about knowledge. But I think it's important to remember that interests, by which IR people actually mean institutions, because they think that institutions are created because of the interests of states. international institutions are created because of that. But interest, power, and knowledge are actually tightly intertwined. And so what I thought I would be doing here is focus in particular on three different themes. One is the institutions, the second is the expertise, and the third is power. And I'm going to try to read the 4I framework through these different lenses, too complicated. Just to say, to begin with, I think that first part on institutions in the article is actually really, that's my favorite one. I mean, I just learned so much that I didn't know before, also about economics and how economics works institutionally and how the silos and gaps are exclusionary. What I like a lot about that section is that you talk about missing institutions. And this is something that we often kind of forget, that there are certain institutions that should exist. And I'm very specifically now actually thinking about UN Women, which just didn't exist for a very, very long time. It's a young institution that was created, but Sakiko, in the article, you talk about institutions more broadly that are concerned with issues of inclusion and equity. But here, from my perspective, when we talk about institutions and international institutions in particular, I also like to ask myself, there's so much effort that has gone into changing these institutions already, and there's feminist strategies that have been employed to try that. One, of course, is gender mainstreaming. The other one is creating a separate institution like UN Women. And the wisdom that's out there is all of this is needed. But as we look at what has been the results of that, just to get back to the barriers, what have been the barriers there more broadly? There's actually a lot of research that's out there on this already. People talking about cooptation, of course. You talked about the missions and the way in which institutions come with missions. When you mainstream something into a mission, well, it gets co-opted. There's evaporations, there's normalizations, there's silencing, there are simplifications, there's the reduction of DEI to inclusion and numbers. Let's just put in more women and that will fix it, that kind of logic. So there's a lot of critique there of an effort actually to overcome barriers that are institutional barriers that have to do precisely with institutions doing the thing that institutions were mandated to do. And, we know that that generates resistances and that institutions are just difficult to change. But I think there have also been learnings, and I think it's important to also recognize that institutions learn, institutions adapt themselves, institutions do change. And I would actually like to remind, in particular this group, that in a way there's a lot more that has happened in the field of development than has happened in other fields with regard to gender equality. In part, this is because the gender issue has been around in development much longer than, and I'm thinking specifically in the security field, which is of course a field that we deal with a lot of in IR. And if I compare the kind of discourses that are around there, the kinds of ideas that are around there, there's actually a lot that has happened in the economics field, in development economics. Hasn't gone to macroeconomics, well understood, but there is institutional learning that has happened, and there's elements of progress. I try to, when I look at institutional change in international governments, it strikes me that there's almost like a three-step, or when you talk about gender experts in that field, there's the people that see themselves as activists. And very often, and it's very different by issue areas. So if you look into the security field, there's a lot more activism. People that also feel that there are that they're, they're isolated and that they're just those single people that need to change things. Then you have the fields that are more institutionalized, where you have like your gender markers and your policies and your targets and your trainings and all of that gender mainstreaming stuff, which I think is temporarily later. And then you have actually fields where you have serious expertise, because the big complaint about gender mainstreaming is also always that, well, these people don't really know anything about our fields, and here they are, and they want us to do gender, but they actually don't know anything. And it strikes me that feminist economics is actually one of those rare areas where there is real deep gender expertise. You may feel, and Sakiko were also talking about, that there's not enough of it, and I'm sure there's not enough of it, but it's all comparative, it strikes me. Even having a journal and having an association is actually quite unusual in the scheme of thinking about other issue areas. Let me move on to talk about expertise a little more. So your article, that's where it's centered. And I actually feel that most of it really is about expertise. You call it knowledge politics. The way I read it is the informational deficits is really about the experts. It's about the economists, how they become experts, what they embody. And then you have the ideology and the biases, which I see to pertain to expertise. And I think it might be interesting to think about a little bit more as to the way in which people theorize or have theorized expertise in international governance, because I think there's also 3 different ways of thinking about that. On the one hand, expertise is a discourse, and I think a lot of the critique of orthodox economics is actually at this level of discourse. The second way of understanding that, and that's what I think, that's why that article spoke to me so much, is also that it is a community, right? And you talk about an epistemic community. I would think that one needs to think of expertise as a social field. I'm talking here with Bourdieu more. And the third understanding is that it is an assemblage. I'm not going to get into this right now, because I really like to think of expertise as a social field. And when we think of expertise as a social field, it brings into view a structure of a field, right? A field has hierarchies, a field has boundaries, a field has positions in which people relate to each other. A field is populated by, in this instant, experts. And you have to ask yourself then, how did you become an expert? And who is an expert? So it's about boundaries, inclusion, exclusion criteria, and things of that nature. And there's struggles about this, right? About, so what's the boundary? What's the expertise? And so on. And I think that's where we're operating. What strikes me about economics is just how incredibly hierarchical that field is. And this is purely by watching our economics department, actually. When I learned about REPEC, how crazy is that? This is a system where you rank every single economist in the world from 1 to whatever 1,000, right? And you can find yourself on that list. That's insane. Right? But it designs the hierarchy of the field. Other practices such as, I'm going into, I've been sitting on hiring committees, and people are basically saying, well, why don't you eliminate all the people that don't come from the Ivy Leagues? We don't even look at those. People actually say that. Just imagine the kind of exclusion of ideas that happens in one stroke there, that just is sidelined. So it's a field that's highly hierarchical. It's a field that's highly exclusionary. And I want to talk about methods here a little bit, because, and this goes back to, Weber famously has this definition of the expert, where he says the dilettante differs from the expert really only in in the sense that he has a lack of a firm and reliable work procedure. It's method, right? It's method that makes the expert. But here the question then is in economics, it's like, there's just one legitimate method, and it's econometrics that seduces with its numbers and with its pretense of objectivity. You talked about this. This is actually pernicious in a number of different ways. Not only in the sense that it in the field, right? There's kind of this construction of there's a lot of symbolic capital that comes with knowing economics, and kind of there's this understanding that people who don't know econometrics, I should say, people who don't know econometrics don't actually know all that much. At the same time, it's perfectly acceptable not to know anything about the critique of positivism, right? To be totally ignorant about that. So that's that kind of knowing of the fact in which economics and politics intertwine is actually devalued entirely. And so you have this lack of diversification. I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's also to say that there is it's actually it's a very non-democratic field by virtue of its commitment to positivist economics. It's this it entails that idea that even in the relationship to politics, it's the economist that will know, and he will tell you the truth, as opposed to actually other fields of thinking that are out there in thinking about the relationship of science to politics, of seeing the scientist much more as, talking here with Pilke, an honest broker, somebody who says, there's multiple ways of understanding this. This is happening when you do this. This is happening when you do that. I'll give you some options, but it's actually a democratic politics that needs to decide as to what kind of a politics should be implemented, as opposed to finding the one kind of wisdom. Just a few words on power, which was my third point. I think the one thing, I think you don't do enough of that in the article, actually. I think you do it in when you talk about ideology, and you actually had it on a slide right now. But I think, international governance is embedded in an international liberal order, and that international liberal order is a political construct that is supported by a hegemonic state, still hegemonic, with hegemonic state coalitions that have disproportionate voting powers in the IAFFEs. It's supported by a hegemonic set of social forces, finance capital, multinational capital. You talked about, Diane talked about the rich, right? And it is supported by a neoliberal ideology, and you do recognize that, and you pick that up. But there is this element of hegemony that economics contributes to, which I think adds another layer of barriers to changing this. Now, the current moment, it's depressing. It's depressing. Nothing else to say about it. But they're breaking things. They're also breaking the liberal international order. And there's the question that I'm asking myself there is, this may end up also being an opportunity. I'm not actually sure that neoliberalism is disappearing, but there's a lot that is being broken. And so for feminist economics to overcome barriers, I think it's important to be out there right now, to be loud right now, to speak it out loud in all kinds of forums, much more forcefully than ever before, because there's something else that is going to be born out of these craziness that's going on right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You covered a lot of ground there, from institutions to some of the limitations but importance of gender mainstreaming, to tying us back to this current moment, and I think a great segue to thinking about how we can, as the feminist economics community, speak up right now. So I want to go ahead and open up the floor to your questions and comments. You're welcome to, again, use the raise hand function. And also, I do see that we have one question in the chat, so you're welcome to put them there as well. What I'm going to do is take a few questions and comments and then give our speakers a chance to respond, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do a second round. So as I don't see any raised hands yet, I want to read the question in the chat. Apologies if I get your name wrong. Here, I think it's Hisu. Can experimental models of local feminist leadership effectively challenge patriarchal economic and social structures, thereby offering scalable alternatives for national governance? Great question. Are there others? I don't see any other hands yet, but Bina, I see your physical hand. So yeah, jump in.
Did you want them to address the first question before I ask? Or?
No, I want to take a few questions and comments,
Okay.
and give them a chance to respond.
Yeah, so first of all, this is, thank you very much for organizing this. This is really very rich and very interesting. And I hadn't read Sakiko's paper, which I will now, but, and also the comments. So thank you all three for this. So these are just reflections on what I've heard. And I wanted to, one is that I do agree with Diane that the dichotomy, if we make it macro, meso, micro, then it is much more between the macro, those who consider themselves macroeconomists, and those who don't, those who do the applied stuff, and micro. But perhaps conceptually, we also have a responsibility of linking those up, possibly. But I do want to raise another kind of divide, which is the North-South divide. Again, it's not across all of North, not across all of South. But you see this within even microeconomics. So for instance, the obvious example is RCT, the way it took over. And so it emerged in the North, and then the South becomes the space for experiments, NGOs and others, and so on and so forth. And it actually ticks many of the boxes that Sakiko talks about. There is an issue of power, there is an issue of funding. Funding becomes extremely important in how you take ideas, certain kinds of ideas in economics forward, even if they're gendered. So there's a lot of stuff that Duflo and others do, which is gendered. But it's still driven through very large funding. And if you remember, Sakiko, you're nodding that many of the journals were then taken over. So the way in which the epistemic works is how do you take over those journals? And then you have the definition that those are the journals which count. If you don't publish in them, you're not going to get promotions. So that link, I think, is extremely important. A third point is that even in relation to I think the North-South within feminist economics. So I must share a little bit of a frustration in the topics that become privileged. So for instance, there's huge amount of work in the West, in Europe, in the US, and so on labor markets, on employment. And of course, there's the work on the care economy and how that affects women in the labor market. But for those of us who work on issues of property and inequality, which are much more structural inequalities, there is very little engagement within the feminist community. So it's almost like Marx talked about labor and capital, that women are the labor and men are the capital, but somehow we're not willing to say that assets matter, property matters, those inequalities matter. So there are issues within the framing of feminist economics and what people work on, and what is it driven by, I think we need to have a little bit of self-reflection about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bina. Let me take a hand and then one more question in the chat, and then I'm going to turn back to our speakers. So I hope I get your name right here. Is it Ewa?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope you hear me. I joined really to thank Sakiko, Diane, and Elizabeth for excellent presentation, and also for the paper, because I also think the paper is very, very rich to pursue and to further develop different aspects. I have a question related to this 4 Eyes framework, which I believe it's a very sort of overall general. How do you see the regional perspective on this framework? What Bina said, that each region has a very specific priority items for research. For example, labor market issues, which you just mentioned, look very differently in the South than in the North. So how would you see this regional aspects in the further works of this project?
Thank you so much. And then we had a question from Deb in the chat that says, I would like to ask about gender mainstreaming. There are great advances that this can promote, but could gender mainstreaming blur the feminist aspect of feminist economics? Maybe through increasing stigma towards the word feminist, or maybe through other channels. So I'll now turn back to each of you for a few minutes of responses. Sakiko, let's start with you.
I've been really enjoying this enormously. It's such incredible comments. That's very stimulating. I mean, I must say there's no comment that I thought was irrelevant or, that I disagreed with. So thank you so much for all of the different kind of comments that you made. I mean, some of the ones that I would highlight are, first of all, I mean, just kind of like maybe moving backwards. I mean, Bina, the north-south element, I think is terribly important. I mean, it's within feminist economics and then within economics, it's a sort of like a dimension that can overlay, that could be thought about within each one of these 4 eyes. The 4 eyes is really an effort to have a conceptual framework for thinking about barriers. And so it can be used almost like as a checklist, because the problem with thinking about barriers is that one gets fixated on one thing and then doesn't recognize that these 4 barriers are interlinked through the reality of power structures, right? And so thank you also for Elisa for pointing out that there isn't enough about power in this particular paper. And so you're totally right. And in fact, in doing this, in preparing for this presentation, I was rereading this paper, right? And thinking, oh yeah, there should be more about power. So, I mean, I think that some of these comments go in the direction of developing this framework further and sort of like tidying it up, elaborating on it as a conceptual framework that can be used in a flexible way to think about the problem of barriers. And the issue of the regional frameworks, I mean, once again, this is just a framework. You can use it in different regions. And so the kinds of power structures that exist in different regions, I think is, varies. I'm not sure if I want to sort of say much more, because I don't want to kind of hog the the time here. But a lot of what Lisa and Diane said, really enrich a lot of thinking about this conceptual framework, like, what Lisa was talking about, the importance of institutions and things like, methods, and, considering, how these concepts also relate to expertise in social fields. And I mean, I think there's another kind of like a conceptual exploration to do there. And I thought that what Diane and many others were also saying about this particular moment also highlights certain aspects, like not just missing, but destroying institutions and destroying data. I mean that, but once again, one can see what is happening today in terms of destroying institutions and trying to control universities and destroying databases as part of this broader picture of creating barriers. Because once again, I just want to emphasize that we're talking about the importance of knowledge and barriers to the spread of knowledge that is driven by power structures, and that they do interrelate. And I think that's the whole point about it, that we can understand the destruction of data and how that relates to the information and ideology, and how so we can begin to understand in this present moment the dynamics of what is going on, and then we can be better prepared to sort of think about how to address it.
Thank you so much, Sakiko. Diane and Elizabeth, I'm going to ask a very difficult task to try and respond to these questions in about 3 to 4 minutes. So Diane, over to you.
So it's impossible to respond in detail to the rich set of issues that have been raised. So I'll just say I think this framework that Sakiko has put forward is a useful starting point because it's sufficiently flexible to take account of regional differences and even within regions differences, both in the epistemic communities in academia and also in the policymaking arenas, and also the combinations of forces that push for and against particular policies. So I think it's sufficiently flexible. It would be very interesting to apply it to the case that Bina raised of the RCTs, which overcame barriers, which came from nowhere and then came to be the way you had to research and develop policy on poverty. I think that's a kind of maybe a good case in why weren't there any barriers, or if there were barriers, how were they overcome? That might be quite an interesting kind of case study to look at. I think thinking about these barriers as variegated and maybe having certain contradictions within them, not completely impermeable or not completely rigid, and so where there's room for maneuver. So somebody asked about gender mainstreaming. There was a time at the time of the Beijing Platform for Action when we thought this idea of gender mainstreaming would create more room for maneuver. But now we have to face the fact that maybe it didn't. Maybe it shut down certain avenues and channeled the efforts of feminists, including feminist economists, in directions that were not totally productive. So I think we have to be alive to those different complexities. And I think we're at the beginning of a journey in IAFFE in thinking about the barriers to feminist economics, and the barriers in policy, the barriers in the academy, the barriers in public understanding of economics. I think that's also something we have to be aware of, and the very contradictory conversations that we might get into, for instance, about unpaid work. Now, I can see some people actually in some countries really celebrating unpaid work, so we need more of it, and we need women to be doing more of it, and we don't want them to be thinking about going to politics or the labour market or acquiring assets. We want them to stay at home and do all the unpaid work. So I think we have to be aware of the way that, let's say, recognition of unpaid work, which is part of the bedrock of feminist economics, can be complex, can be recognized in ways that were not actually helpful for the realization of women's rights, and that barrier to the recognition of unpaid work. In that way, the barriers easily fall. But if you're arguing that for a different way of recognizing unpaid work, then the barriers rise up. They don't so easily fall. And I think our framework is sufficiently flexible to be able to take account of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Elizabeth.
I get the last word. I want to start where Diane started her remarks, and that's the diversity of feminist economics. It's one of the messages that I take away from this. And I think that probably in the Barriers Project, we have to be quite aware of that also in terms of the way in which we deal with that, in which we talk about that, because there's this assumed we, which I don't know where exactly it sits. And it links maybe also to some of the questions in the chat about the idea of whether local feminist leadership can effectively challenge. Yes, maybe, right? One needs to be aware to that. And Bina's very interesting comment about journals. I'm always listening to journals, and even the way in which journals are actually can be quite colonial in the way they style themselves, including feminist journals. I think there's a recognition to be had there. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And Laura, I see you have your hand, but unfortunately we're a little bit short of time here. So I just want to say a few things in closing. And the first is that, as Diane eloquently said, this is the beginning of a journey. So, we're going to continue to have online events on this. This is going to be a multi-year project for IAFFE. So there's a lot of opportunity to continue to engage on this. And as our speakers have all reflected today in the comments as well, this could not be a more important time for us to think about these barriers, to reflect on the new ones that are coming up day by day, and to also think about how we're coming together as a community and what this we means, as Elizabeth said, to address them. We'll have upcoming opportunities at the IAFFE conference for everyone's awareness. We're also organizing a remote conference this year, as I know travel to the US might not be an option or an interest to many people. So we want to create opportunities to engage in, share feminist economics knowledge and continue to create opportunities to, really build community with each other during this time as well. So with that, I just want to say we appreciate everyone joining today. Please look out for future events in this series. We will also have upcoming online events on a number of other topics, so please look out for that. And I really hope that you find an opportunity to engage in either the in-person conference or, again, the remote conference this year, where we'll be having a number of events as well as opportunities to present research. That's all from me, Sakiko. We have a couple minutes. Do you have any final words of reflection? You're muted.
I just want to thank everybody, and particularly all the people who spoke either from the floor, so to speak, or in presentations. And I think it gives us an enormously rich set of ideas to move forward in terms of an agenda for the committee, because the project to do this work is actually an ongoing idea to develop, thinking and discussion about this. So we will have a background paper that will be done, but at the conference in Amherst, we will have some sort of a round table. There will be a session there where we're launching a whole program of work, including particularly a special issue of a journal. So I hope that many of you who are here today start thinking about what you might be interested even in your own research to study some of these issues. So, and thank you, Mary, for hosting this discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sakiko. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you all for joining today. Laura, who is it? Laura put an idea in the chat of creating some kind of Slack channel or ongoing digital community to continue this discussion. So I think that's a great idea, and we'll kind of give thought to how we can continue this discussion. We'll be in touch soon. So solidarity to you all through these challenging times and as we confront these barriers. But I have faith in us as a community. Have a great day, everyone.